The USS Indianapolis is most associated with the World War II ship that was lost just days before the end of the war, and the story of those who survived. Just after midnight on July 30th, 1945, the Indianapolis, carrying 1,197 sailors and Marines, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. The heavy cruiser, on its way back to the Philippines after delivering components for the atomic bomb, went down in about 12 minutes. About 900 crewmen survived the sinking. Some were in lifeboats, but most bobbed in the water only with life jackets, hoping, waiting to be saved. Listen to a scene from the classic movie Jaws as Quint, played by Robert Shaw, tells the story.
Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into our side, Chief. He was coming back from the island of Tinian to Leyte, just delivered the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb. 1,100 men went into the water. The vessel went down in 12 minutes. Didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer. You know how you know that when you're in the water, Chief? You tell by looking from the dorsal to the tail. What we didn't know was our bomb mission had been so secret, no distress signal had been sent. They didn't even list us overdue for a week. Very first light, Chief. The sharks come cruising. So we formed ourselves into tight groups. You know, it's kind of like old squares in a battle, like you see in a calendar, like the Battle of Waterloo, and the idea was, shark comes to the nearest man, that man he starts pounding and hollering and screaming. Sometimes the shark would go away. Sometimes he wouldn't go away. Sometimes that shark, he looks right into you, right into your eyes. You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes. When he comes at you, he doesn't seem to be living until he bites you, and those black eyes roll over white, and then you hear that terrible high-pitched screaming. The ocean turns red, and in spite of all the pounding and the hollering, they all come in and they rip you to pieces. You know, by the end of that first dawn, lost 100 men. I don't know how many sharks, maybe 1,000. I don't know how many men. They average 6 an hour. On Thursday morning, Chief, I bumped into a friend of mine, Herbie Robinson from Cleveland. Baseball player, bosun's mate. I thought he was asleep. Reached over to wake him up. Bobbed up and down in the water. It was like a kind of top. Upended. Well, he'd been bitten in half below the waist. Noon the 5th day, Mr. Hooper, Lockheed Ventura saw us. He swung in low and he saw us too. A young pilot, a lot younger than Mr. Hooper anyway. He saw us and he come in low, and 3 hours later, a big fat PBY comes down and started to pick us up. You know, that was the time I was most frightened, waiting for my turn. I'll never put on a life jacket again. So 1,100 men went in the water. 316 men come out. The sharks took the rest. June the 29th, 1945. Anyway, we delivered the bomb.
Pretty graphic, but that'll tell you some of the things that our soldiers, sailors, Marines went through to bring you freedom. Douglas Dietrich, son of a retired U.S. Navy sailor, Douglas worked for 10 years as a Department of Defense research librarian, where one of his major duties was document destruction. He then experienced the 1991 Kuwaiti campaign, serving in Desert Storm as a United States Marine. Douglas has studied the historical process of the sacrifice of those on the USS Indianapolis, her captain, her crew, following delivery of those components critical to the deployment of the atomic bomb. Here is Douglas Dietrich this hour. Douglas, what a story. What a story.
Yes, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share it with everyone in our audience, Mr. Norrie. It's always great to be here, and really great to hear about your mother's birthday. I want to thank the Coast to Coast AM audience for all the prayers they gave my mother during her time of passing.
Douglas, this story illustrates just one of the many unbelievable, heroic things that our men and women went through during all these wars.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought up the Veterans, the Memorial Day. It's a hard day for me as well because I was just out there at the Presidio today, and we had one of the largest Memorial Day celebrations and parades in the nation in the cemetery here. And a lot of people were arguing about the different fatality statistics, which you were kind enough to bring up. And just keep in mind that a lot of these statistics just get skewed for different reasons. And I'll get into the Indianapolis right now as part of that process because a lot of the men and soldiers who die in Iraq, for instance, a lot of them are flown to Germany, and a lot of them get injuries where they die later on in Germany, and they're not counted as battlefield fatalities. But with the Indianapolis, what we had was something very specific, very different. It was a very special mission, a very critical mission. At the same time, unfortunately, there was a dichotomy between what the civilian command under Harry Truman, who had just become president, had understood, and what a lot of the old, more conventional Navy High Command and U.S. Army High Command were thinking. General Curtis LeMay himself really didn't take the atomic bomb seriously. He thought he was doing a lot of damage with incendiary firebombing. He thought of the atomic bomb as simply a physics bomb, a kind of different kind of firebomb. So no one was really putting any effort into security consciousness when the Indianapolis was sent out from Mare Island, San Francisco, where I'm at today, not at Mare Island itself, but of course in the city. I was at Mare Island earlier today. But on July 16th of 1945, the Indianapolis flagship of the United States Fifth Fleet in the Pacific, heavy cruiser, was sent out carrying the components and the enriched uranium of the Little Boy bomb to Tinian Island, where it was to be delivered. And it was sent without escort. Unbelievable. And it brings to mind the USS Hood, which the British had known about for years as needing heavy armoring, but they just kept putting off the repairs or the reinforced armoring that was needed on the USS Hood and just kept telling the captain of the Hood, speed is armor, speed is armor. And, of course, a lucky shot was sent out by the Bismarck that sunk the Hood and over 1,000 crewmen with it. This is kind of what happened with the Indianapolis. The Indianapolis was told to go at full speed to Tinian Island, and when it reached Tinian Island and delivered the bomb, it was not given any information concerning what American signals intelligence units already knew about the submarine that was going to sink it.
And Douglas, if the USS Indianapolis had not gotten there with the components for the atomic bomb, I want you to tell us what could have happened. We'll be back in a moment with Douglas Dietrich as we talk about the USS Indianapolis this Memorial Day night. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Next hour, Who's Behind the Secret Door? We'll have 3 guests throughout the night. I have no idea who they are. We'll take phone calls with them as well. We'll figure it out together, won't we? Up next, we'll be back with Douglas Dietrich as we talk about the USS Indianapolis. What an incredible story. Next on Coast to Coast AM. And in a moment, we'll take some of your calls with historian Douglas Dietrich as we talk about the USS Indianapolis. Douglas, had it gotten sunk before they delivered the components, what would have that done to the war effort?
Well, the war effort would have continued, and it was heading towards an apocalypse. We have to remember that so far they had a Germany-first policy under Roosevelt, which had dominated the American mobilization effort, so that, as unbelievable as this may seem to the American public, after Pearl Harbor, only 15% of America's war economy, its troops, its equipment, up to this point in the war in 1945, was going to the Pacific. And a total of 1/3 of that was going to the Alaskan front, where they were trying to defeat an invasion by Japanese Marines in the Aleutian Islands. So the war was just beginning. And on the very day of the Hiroshima bombing itself, on August 6th, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, received a special report that told him about the Japanese divisions that were being mobilized. They had already mobilized 30 new divisions, which secured China. They had the manpower to mobilize at least 42 more on the mainland, 23 that were going to be deployed against the Americans themselves, and at least 5 armored divisions. And all of this was heading in the direction of the Americans, and what the Americans had been basically facing up to this point with the Japanese was the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Marines.
Why did the ship go down so quickly?
The ship went down so quickly because the ship was sunk by a secret Japanese weapon known as the Kai-10 weapon, which the Americans did not want to bring up at Captain McVeigh's court-martial. And that's part of the travesty of what happened. Captain McVeigh was not given information concerning the I-58 in that area. He was not given any escort. And when he left Tiananmen Island after delivering the bomb, basically he was hit by the I-58 launching suicide torpedoes, manned torpedoes, which it would have been impossible for him to evade because they were guided by men.
What do you mean manned torpedoes? The men were in the torpedoes?
That is correct. This was the Kai-10. This has been brought up in several naval studies. It's the subject of enormous controversy. I can tell you for a fact that it did happen. We can go into that if some of the callers are interested, but the most important thing about it was because of the nature of the weapon, the U.S. Navy did not want to bring this up at his trial. They did not bring up any of the intelligence information available from Ultra at his trial. He was very much railroaded. Even the captain of the submarine that sank him, the Japanese captain Mitsura Hashimoto, who after the ceasefire was brought into his trial to act as a witness against him, tried to inform the jury at his court-martial that there was nothing that Captain McVeigh could have done. And they just misinterpreted whatever he said in Japanese into English and said he had launched conventional torpedoes. And there was an enormous controversy concerning the trial later, which is why President Clinton, years later, exonerated Captain McVeigh. Unfortunately, it was too late for McVeigh because after his prosecution, he was driven so much by the hounding of many families of the sailors who were on his ship under his command that he killed himself. Very sadly, very tragically, and there's a number of reasons why that travesty occurred. After he had delivered the bomb intact to Tiananmen Island, what had happened was they did send out a distress signal when they were sunk. We have to remember that when Jaws was written and Peter Benchley was writing the script, that they did not know this because that was not released until maybe a few decades after Jaws was released. But the truth was he sent out distress signals that were received by 3 different recipients in the U.S. Navy. One of the officers was dead-faced drunk. The other one was in a room with a prostitute and ordered his men not to disturb him. And another one basically thought it was a Japanese propaganda prank. And so no one sent any help to the Indianapolis, and the men were in the ocean dying of dehydration. They were eaten alive by the largest shark attack in American history. And I do want to emphasize to the American people that this is the kind of image we have of the last major warship sunk in the Second World War. We have to remember the war with a feeling of solemnity because it is so analogous to the situation which America found itself in after World War II, which was not an overwhelming victory, but Korea and Vietnam and now Iraq and Afghanistan. We are still in that shark-feeding frenzy in Asia, and he was one of the sacrificial victims of it, Captain McVeigh and his men. Think of the trauma they went through after being discovered strictly by accident by a PBY that spotted them, a Catalina on anti-submarine patrol, suddenly spots them and basically leads to their rescue, calls in the people, including one of the men who would later on become the Secretary of the Navy, who fly in and ultimately ahead of the ships try to strap as many men as they can onto the pontoons of their amphibious airplanes so that they can fly them to ships. Because
they all would have been wiped out, Douglas.
That is correct. They all would have been wiped out if it hadn't been for this timely accident, and nobody would have known what had happened. And but sadly, while this was going on, Truman, of course, who himself had been a former artillery officer, he understood what it was like in combat. He unfortunately was not in the United States. He was coming home crossing the Atlantic, and unfortunately his staff was given a different story by the people on Tiananmen Island. See, what had happened was after the Indianapolis had dropped off the bomb, the Tiananmen Island people were working with Little Boy, and there was an accidental neutron surge, which went Cherenkov blue, a shade of blue you never want to see. People remember it from the movie about the Manhattan Project, where Dr. Louis Slotin was the historical figure who was portrayed as melting down, so to speak, underneath radiation exposure from the bomb beginning to go critical in terms of its components. That's what happened with Little Boy, and it destroyed the weapon's yield ability to the extent where not only did it kill a bunch of scientists who went through a horrible death, but Dr. Luis Alvarez had to insert all of the world's known supply of polonium into the core assembly so that the bomb would go off at all. This was the equivalent of injecting nitrous oxide.
I did not know that, Doug. Let's take a few calls here while we still have you. Let's go to Richard in Estacada, Oregon. Hey, Richard, thanks for calling.
Yes, I'm calling in with a question. My father came home from the European conflict in World War II, and when he passed away, in his drawer, I found a knife that I guess the soldiers wore on their side, and the name that's inscribed on the shaft of the knife is I'll spell it. It's CATTARAUGUS, and then it's 2250. Now, how would I find out anything about the history of that?
That, sir, would be something to consult an antiques expert about, especially one who deals in collectible militaria. Unfortunately, that's not exactly my specialty. I did a lot of document destruction, work with documents, which is how I can give a more strategic perspective on incidents like this that otherwise don't seem to make much sense. But it's certainly good that you're seeking, and I invite you to seek more information on that through people who deal in militaria, and that's what you would look up. People who deal in militaria, either online or collectibles in the phone book. People who deal in antiques would direct you towards military specialists.
How come the world truly doesn't know about the USS Indianapolis story, Doug?
Because what had happened was it had such a shameful history to it. When Dr. Luis Alvarez did what he did because the Little Boy had been so compromised, he had to do that on the night before it was dropped over Hiroshima. He basically had broke all protocols. It was a significant breach of protocol because by using up all of the polonium plugs, that was all of America's accessible supply, there was no polonium left as a fissionable insurance if there ever was another uranium bomb. And Nagasaki was not a uranium bomb. It was a plutonium bomb, which is why the bombs look so different. But if they had another uranium bomb, they wouldn't have any fissile insurance to make it go off. And so he had to defend himself, and what he said was, it was Captain McVeigh in the Indianapolis. The boys, they jarred it all up, and they dislodged the components. That was his excuse. And what they did was they ran Captain McVeigh up a rail. And so they just weren't going to accept anything that would have gotten McVeigh off the hook, even from the man who ran the submarine, who commanded the submarine, Hashimoto, that sank his ship. And that is a tremendous tragedy where we have bureaucrats and scientists who are shafting it to the men who fight for us.
Let's go to Harlingen, Texas. Glenn's with us east of the Rockies. Glenn, go ahead.
How you doing, George?
Good, thank you.
Sir, what is your name?
My name's Douglas Dietrich, sir, and I invite you to hit me up on Facebook.com/Douglas Dwayne Dietrich. I have to use my middle name because there's hundreds of Douglas Dietrichs out there. My middle name's spelled Duane. So please follow me on Facebook.com/Douglas Dwayne Dietrich. And that way you can also follow up on the book that is at the publishers right now. And also...
Well, sir...
yeah.
My father was all 4 years on board a cruiser in the Pacific.
Yes, sir.
Cruisers were fast supply, used for fast supply, as well as bombardment like the battleships and escort.
Yeah.
And the Indianapolis was just on a clandestine mission. I've never heard such rabid anti-militarism and anti-Americanism in my life. I mean, George, I for one...
From who?
I think this is just a little bit too far.
From who?
Your guest.
No, he's not.
That's the way I see it.
On what? Give me one example. He's talking about what happened to the ship.
Well, it was on a clandestine mission.
Yeah, of course.
There was no one's fault. and the Japanese had...
Wait. The captain was court-martialed.
Yes, and
I know that. But
don't forget, sir, that not only that, but the ship, when it did not arrive, was reported as having arrived. That is part of the problem. There was an enormous amount of incompetence and corruption that was going on in that theater, and there were plenty of good men in that theater. The overwhelming
and Doug, if I'm hearing you right, you're supporting the captain and the ship and all the crew members.
I'm supporting the sailors like the captain and like my father, who was a sailor for over 30 years and 3 wars. You can visit my father's grave in upstate New York, and his tombstone, which is provided by the Veterans Administration, says World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
Sometimes people just don't listen, Douglas.
I think because it is alarming to hear that this kind of political infighting and compromise goes on, people don't like to hear the fact that the team is divided. And what we have to remember is, even with the Vietnam Memorial Wall, it's not your U.S. government that set that wall up. It was a South Republican Vietnamese, by that I mean from the Republic of South Vietnam, a young Asian lady, an emigre, who valued the sacrifices that Americans made for her anti-communist republic so much that she organized the creation of that wall, not your U.S. government. Remember that, and it's up to us, all of us as individuals, to honor these servicemen, because oftentimes, sadly, our government does not.
You know, every Memorial Day, I try to at least take a portion of this program to remember our fallen soldiers, men and women. But you know what, Douglas? A lot of people still think Memorial Day is strictly barbecue.
It's very sad, and I do want people to understand that even in terms of the sacrifices we make, there are always people who are in the trenches with us. I appreciate the fact you brought up the Canadians and people from other countries.
Of course.
Obviously, I come from Taiwan, which was a rabidly anti-communist nation. But in terms of, for instance, World War II and the Pacific Theater, Americans tend to think they were in it all by themselves. The reality is, if you ask a British person about World War II in the Pacific, they're going to remember Impal and Kohima, which no Americans ever heard of, but that was the equivalent in India of Stalingrad and Leningrad, where the British, using American Lend-Lease Sherman tanks, fought tremendous armored engagements with the Japanese and the Asian Indians who were fighting against British colonial rule. Massive engagements, totally unknown to American history, and most of the time, maps of the Pacific Theater that Americans produce don't even show India on the map.
So whatever happened to the captain afterwards?
So what happened to the captain was his court-martial was incredibly scandalous to the men like Chester Nimitz, who were in charge of the U.S. Navy during who were in charge of large portions of the U.S. Navy during World War II. He wasn't up there with Admiral King in terms of running the entire fleet effort, but what Nimitz did was he used his own power to reinstate Captain McVeigh into active command. But it wasn't enough. McVeigh was continually harassed by many people because he had been publicly disgraced, and many Americans, sadly, held him responsible for the last loss of a major ship in World War II, and he ultimately was driven to suicide with his own Navy revolver, holding a toy sailor in his hand to represent all the sailors who had died before him. And this was in 1968, about 2 years after I was born.
Nancy's in Waterford, Connecticut, and she's up with us. Hi, Nancy.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I appreciate your guest, who is even talking about something that maybe not everyone, obviously, the previous caller, doesn't appreciate. But I think that it's important that we look at our veterans individually and not just as political entities, little puppets on a stage, so to speak. I think it's important that we look at them for what they do, per person. And this man, I think, had a lot of valor, and it's really unfortunate. But it's important that we hear his story, and so I'll be looking for that book. I wanted to comment just to say, kind of a honor to my dad, who fought in the Pacific during World War II. He was in the Army Air Corps, and he didn't do anything extraordinary, and he was just a gunner and those little round turrets that you might remember seeing in the planes, which I think was a very scary place to be. But he survived, and he wasn't never badly injured. I also wanted to mention the man torpedoes that I guess one was used to bomb the Indianapolis.
Mm-hmm.
There were three of them.
I recently read a book about the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and one of the survivors of Nagasaki was a little boy. He was only 8, being trained to man the torpedo because the people in the torpedoes had to be very small. So they liked to choose smart children, trainable children, or very tiny men. And the reason the boy survived the bombing was because he dove underwater and held his breath, because part of their training was to be able to hold their breath for a very long period. Because they were told that they were going to probably survive doing this. You know, you're going to go bomb a boat and then swim to the surface. But, of course, mostly they were suicide bombers. But it's intriguing. I didn't realize that that's what was used to bomb the Indianapolis. But thank you very much for having your guest on tonight.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And, of course, we'll have our secret door guests in just a few minutes. Douglas, as we wrap this hour up, what are you working on these days?
Well, I want that young lady to know that certainly her father survived something that was statistically improbable. The people who were in the U.S. Army Air Corps bombing over the Axis had a far lower survival rate than U.S. Marines. And but in terms of herself, I appreciate certainly her observations on that. I would bring up the fact that what I'm trying to point out is that our men deserve the best, and a lot of the men who jumped off of the Indianapolis had lifesavers and life jackets that just didn't even inflate. And so this is the kind of quality equipment they were issued with that also led to a lot of deaths. But what I do want to say also in terms of what I'm working on is I invite her to pick up my DVD, Roswell and the Rising Sun, because it does speak a lot about the Hiroshima bomb and its impact on the war, exactly what direction that took. Another person who survived the atomic bombing was Imperial Japanese Army Field Marshal Shunroko Hata. And he automatically went to Tokyo and said, look, I survived it. It didn't even put a scratch on me. And it was absolutely true. He was right in the epicenter. So he survived just by that amazing fortuitousness. He told the emperor, we've got to keep this war going. So that's one of those ways. Many people, like prisoners of war who were in Hiroshima, survived because they had enough protection under the walls. It wasn't the massive destruction that people think, as horrible as it was. But this is explained in my DVD, Roswell and the Rising Sun. It's supposed to be a convention exclusive for ConspiracyCon. I will be speaking there. That's one reason why the U.S. military did not want to bring up the suicide torpedoes. It was considered an occult weapon. This is very difficult to explain, but this was how the Americans ran into the Japanese concept of occult warfare, and that was where they ran into the first acknowledgement of Kuromaku, or the Japanese concept of the Black Curtain, which was an organization that worked with harnessing occult forces. All of the kamikaze effort was geared towards that. The U.S. military wanted to keep that secret. They were investigating occult forces themselves. I speak of this at my presentation at ConspiracyCon number 11.
And Doug's website, by the way, is linked up at coasttocoastam.com as well. I'll be back in a moment as we go behind the secret door.